Hello, BookTube. We're continuing this weird chapter-by-chapter read-through of The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I started this out with The Two Towers alongside David Wiley and Tony from An Erudite Adventure, and I went chapter by chapter, and then I finished with the final chapter of The Lord of the Rings. But we're not done with the book for a while yet, because Tolkien insisted on having 100 pages of appendices added to the back of his enormous work of fiction. And the appendices are a decidedly uneven thing. They range all over the map in terms of readability or engagement with the reader. The only thing they have in common is that none of them should be here. This was a bad, weak, and worst of all, most damning of all for a perfectionist like Tolkien, unprofessional insistence on his part. These things should not be here. And you'll almost never get a better example of that than the appendix that we're doing today, which is Appendix C, which consists entirely of family trees. What on earth is this doing here? What on earth is this doing here? It's page after page of family trees. That is just so ridiculous. And of course, there's no way, even for a gas bag like me, to talk about page after page of family trees. So I thought instead, I would read you a chunk, going back to Appendix B, that illustrates a whole bunch of things. This is an aspect of the War of the Ring that not a lot of people who don't really study this work keep in mind. A lot of the people who've read this work, or even who haven't read the work and have just seen the movies, think that the War of the Ring was Sauron fighting the forces of the good guys before the gates of Mordor, having lost a battle at Minas Tirith. But actually, Sauron launched multi-pronged attacks when he thought that it was time to do that. And there were battles all over the place that we only get in these appendices. We barely get any hint of them at all. There's a hint that we went over in The Lord of the Rings proper, where Gimli mentions to Legolas, "I wish we had a whole bunch of your people here to fight with us." And Legolas says that a little bit mournfully, he says, "There's no reason for them to march to war. I have a strong feeling that war has marched to them." And he's right. He's right about that, and that includes his own father. And I want to read you the tiny bit here. After the fall of the Dark Tower and the passing of Sauron, the shadow was lifted from the hearts of all who opposed him, but fear and despair fell upon his servants and allies. 3 times Lorien had been assailed from Dol Guldur, but besides the valor of the elven people of that land, the power that dwelt there was too great for any to overcome, unless Sauron had come there himself. Though grievous harm was done to the fair woods on the borders, the assaults were driven back, and when the shadow passed, Celeborn came forth and led the hosts of Lorien over Anduin in many boats. They took Gol Dodgur, and Galadriel threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. In the north also there had been war and evil. The realm of Thranduil, that is Legolas's father, was invaded, and there was long battle under the trees and great ruin of fire. But in the end, Thranduil had the victory. And on the day of the new year of the elves, Celeborn and Thranduil met in the midst of the forest, and they renamed Mirkwood Erin Lascalin, the Wood of Green Leaves. Thranduil took all the northern region as far as the mountains that rise in the forest for his realm, and Celeborn took all the southern wood below the Narrows, and named it East Lorien. But after the passing of Galadriel in the few years, Celeborn grew weary of his realm, and went to Imladris, that is Rivendell, the former home of Elrond, to dwell with the sons of Elrond. In the Greenwood, the Sylvan elves remained untroubled, but in Lorien there lingered sadly only a few of its former people, and there was no longer light or song in Caras Galadhon. At the same time as the great armies besieged Minas Tirith, a host of the allies of Sauron that had long threatened the borders of King Brand crossed the river Carnan, and Brand was driven back to Dale. There he had the aid of the dwarves of Erebor, and there was a great battle at the mountain's feet. It lasted 3 days, but in the end both King Brand and King Dane Ironfoot were slain, and the Easterlings had the victory. They could not take the gate, and many, both dwarves and men, took refuge in Erebor and there withstood a siege. When news came of the great victories in the south, then Sauron's northern army was filled with dismay, and the besieged came forth and routed them. So 2 victories and a defeat, at least a partial defeat, 2 major good guys killed on the battlefield. in the battle at the foot of Erebor. But there is war in King Thranduil's realm, and he wins. And there's war against the borders of Lothlorien, and Celeborn and Galadriel win. And that's all we get of those wars. We don't know anything more about them, including a rather enduring mystery here that isn't cleared up by the wording in these paragraphs. Because when you're talking about military history, just like history just in general, but military history especially, there's a kind of a rhetorical shorthand that writers tend to use. They will offhandedly say, Hannibal took the town of Mediolanum. And they don't mean that Hannibal did that himself. They don't really even mean that Hannibal was anywhere nearby. Same thing, you'll see that all throughout military history in the American Civil War. You will have an account of, General Sheridan taking some town when he was actually 2 or 3 miles away and never came any closer than that to the fighting or the taking. That's a kind of a shorthand, and we could ordinarily just assume that that was the case. Like, for instance, when we're told there was a long battle under the trees and great ruin of fire, but in the end Thranduil had the victory. Well, that means the forces of Thranduil. Thranduil may have fought along with them. That's certainly not a given. It's the sons of Elrond who ride forth to war all through these appendices and in The Lord of the Rings. Elrond doesn't do it himself. He doesn't ride forth himself. When elves don't age, so he's just as hale and hearty as his sons are. But in that case, it's pretty clear. It wasn't just Thranduil. It was Thranduil's forces, and we have no idea whether or not Thranduil participated. Was he the military badass that he is in the Hobbit movies? the only good thing about the Hobbit movies? Or was he, dictating from afar? But you can't assume that across the board when you're dealing with supernatural. When there's a fantasy element involved in this is a high work of fantasy, so there is a fantasy element involved, and that comes into play in the paragraph preceding, where we're told that Lorien is under siege, but that no power can prevail, nothing can prevail against the power of that land. Now, the paragraph makes mention of the valor of the fighting elves. Obviously, elves had to be there with knives and bows, fighting off the forces that were trying to invade from Dol Guldur. But there's also mention made of a power of that land, which is the massive power of Galadriel and Celeborn, who are... Galadriel is there's play made when the Fellowship goes to Lorien. There's play made throughout the Lord of the Rings that hobbits, and by extension you and me, the normal reader, misunderstand what magic is when it comes to elves. That elves are magic. They don't do magic. They are magic, which is why they have a hard time even understanding what other people mean by magic. And that definitely applies to Galadriel. And keep in mind that whatever magic she is greatly enhanced by the fact that she is possessing one of the 3 rings of the Elven Kings, one of the 3 great rings. And so when we're told that nothing could prevail against the power of that land, what does that mean? What form would that take? The Fellowship manages to walk into Lorien. They're not stopped. Now, you might say that's because Galadriel knew who they were, and aside from the doorkeeping caution of her elvish warriors, she was not going to try to prevent them. But what would it have been like if she had tried to prevent them? Could she have prevented them with just the ring? Is this the Third Age version of the Girdle of Melian? Somehow? Obviously not completely, because orcs are able to make headway here. They're able to burn border trees. But it becomes more pointed when we're told what happened after that. When those assaults against Lorien are defeated, Celeborn and Galadriel go out. They leave Lothlorien. They take boats, big elven swan ships, I'm assuming, across the river and assault Dol Guldur, which we can assume is not empty. We can assume that it had at least a garrison remaining, and lots of fell beasts and remaining dark magic. And when that happens, we're told Galadriel threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. And that strikes me as, I know we have that rhetorical device, Hannibal took this town, but that strikes me as personal. There's no way to know because Tolkien doesn't give us any more than this. But that strikes me as personal because the line is, Celeborn came forth and led the hosts of Lorien over Anduin in many boats. Celeborn is leading this force. Galadriel's obviously with him because she's mentioned in the second sentence, in the next sentence she's mentioned. So she's obviously with him, but we're being told that he did that because he's leading the expedition. But he isn't pulling every one of the boats. So that is one kind of the rhetoric, is that Celeborn assaults Dol Guldur. When we hear that, we're hearing that he leads a great force to assault Dol Guldur. But then it switches to specifically Galadriel, who throws down the walls of Dol Guldur and lays open the pits of its basement. That seems to me to be Tolkien saying that she did that herself. And I'd like to know about that. Thanks very much. If that's the case, I'd like to know about that. Can she do that anyway? As one of the Noldor? Or is she doing that because of the ring? And if she's doing that because of the ring, well, this would have been after the fall of Sauron. This would have been after the destruction of the One Ring, wouldn't it? The timing is a little bit blurry in the paragraph, but if it is, then is her ring still effective? Weren't we told over and over again that the three rings would lose their potency once the one was destroyed? So how, if it's Galadriel causing her men to tear down the walls of Guldur, fine. But if she's doing it herself, it seems to me at least as likely, then how is she doing it? I'd love to know. I'd love to see that moment. and also, of course, these paragraphs raise the question about the relationship between Galadriel and Celeborn, which Tolkien, I know, is intentionally drawing a curtain over, at least partially, and I respect that. This is, as we've pointed out many times before in this weird read-through, this is an intentionally vague book in many, many parts. But why doesn't, I guess the essential question is, why doesn't Celeborn go to the west with Galadriel? Or why doesn't she stay with her husband in Middle-earth? I've heard some Tolkien fanatics say that it's all because she was a ring bearer, because she had one of the three rings, but I don't believe that at all. Círdan had one of the three rings forever and ever. He stays in Middle-earth long after the others leave. I don't buy that. I think we're supposed to read between the lines and think that Galadriel and Celeborn are not all that tight. This is what I'm thinking. I think that, too, would make a fascinating story. I would love to hear all of these details. I read passages like this, that battle for 3 days between men and elves and the dark forces of the Easterlings. Oh, what was that like? What was that like? The Battle of Pelennor Fields takes 3 hours. What would a battle of 3 days be like if Tolkien actually wrote it? These 3 paragraphs alone could make another 1,000-page epic. The Lord of the Rings, the War in the North. I would love to see it. Keep in mind what we mentioned about the segment in the Silmarillion of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Keep in mind how many details, how many great personal dramas are just omitted when you're writing it analytically like this, when you're just taking a 30,000-foot view and saying what happened when. Imagine Tolkien writing this epic with those points in. Imagine, even, heresy that it is, a version of Lord of the Rings that is more sweeping, a version of Lord of the Rings that is written along the same lines as Brandon Sanderson or George R.R. Martin, where instead of learning about these other sorties of Sauron that were part of the offensive against Gondor, we see them happening and unfolding fleshed out in dramatic detail at the same time. Tolkien fans would probably rebel against that because it would draw attention away from our heroes. But what if we had other heroes? What if we had more heroes? There's nothing wrong with that. And I want to make 2 points about that before we wrap up. One is that the ability to take this raw material, Lorien being besieged, Lorien fighting back, Galadriel going to Dol Guldur and throwing down its walls, King Thranduil being attacked and winning a victory under the trees, the elves, the dwarves and the men fighting against Easterlings desperately and enduring a siege until they finally see the weakness in their enemy and burst out in what had to have been an incredibly dramatic moment. I want to point out 2 things about this kind of just very sketchy overview. One is that the teen producers of Amazon's The Rings of Power had precisely that authority. This is what they paid $1 billion for. They had precisely the opportunity to take paragraphs like this and do something with them. Now, they chose to set their story far, far earlier than this. But we've seen examples. And Lord knows, we've seen examples already in these appendices of the raw material that they had to work with, and they simply don't. They simply don't. That's point number one, is that we're not getting anything like this. It wouldn't be here. It wouldn't be the elements of the Third Age. But that is what we've been talking about with these appendices. That is how you read these things. You read them by reading in what Tolkien would have made of them if he'd written something narrative about them instead of insisting that his footnotes were in his book. That's what the Rings of Power should have done. Instead of intentionally violating the tenets of the canon that is written in the book. Instead of intentionally violating that everywhere they could. Everywhere. They should have honored those and done what we're talking about here. Fill in the narrative details. And they didn't. We'll get to that. But the other point that I want to make is that someday, I don't know when it will be, maybe our grandchildren will see it, someday this work will be in the common domain. And then people will be free. There have been vast amounts of unauthorized, of course, loving fan fiction of The Lord of the Rings. People have written whole epics about the battle under the trees. But someday it'll be possible for the Tolkien estate to authorize someone to do that. I mean, they could now. They would never do it. But someday it will be a situation much like with, for instance, Dracula, where Dacre Dracula can authorize someone to write a book, and he can also write one himself, but anybody else is free to write about Dracula. They don't need his authorization to do it. Someday that will be the case with this book, and someone will be able to swoop in and write about the War of the Ring from a completely different narrative axis than the one we get in The Lord of the Rings, where they don't advert to Frodo and Sam and the ring at all. They just don't do that at all. Where they adopt instead the viewpoint of 99.9% of the inhabitants of Middle-earth, which is that Sauron is launching a war against them. And that's all. We cannot assume in any way that King Thranduil, and certainly not Dane Ironfoot, knows anything about the ring, much less this desperate gambit. We can't assume that they know anything about it. We have to assume that that information was kept to a very bare minimum of people who know it, because anyone who hears it would think that it's a crazy plan. You're walking the key to the enemy's victory straight to his doorstep. Which means that Thranduil and Dane Ironfoot and, not Lorien, of course, Galadriel knows the plan, but these other leaders don't know. All they know is that Sauron is finally breaking the leader of Mordor and striking. And that they have to fight. That's all. They don't know anything about this slender thread of ultimate victory. That would make for a fantastic story. All of these would make for fantastic stories. Unlike this. And as if family trees weren't bad enough, the next appendix is even worse. So I don't know what we'll talk about then. I don't know, the Red Sox? We'll find something. We're going to get through these appendices, and then we'll take a breath, and then we'll move on to the Fellowship of the Ring, where there's a great deal of meat eventually. But in place, I mean, this is Appendix C, which is just family trees, so there's no way to talk about it. But there is a bit more meat on the bone in some of these other appendices. Not much. They should not be here. But I wanted to take the opportunity to go over these teasers just a bit more. We don't know anything at all about King Thranduil's character, for instance, and he is fighting a war against these forces that are besieging his kingdom. If you were to write that in the way that Tolkien tends to write his story, one of the reasons why it's so utterly remarkable that King Theoden goes to war is because that's not what Tolkien usually does. His idea is that the kings order their forces and send them into battle. Theoden only decides impromptu to go to war because he's expecting to die. So if that's true, then Thranduil had a marshal, or many marshals. We have no idea who they are. No idea what their character is like. No idea what approach they took. And there was battle under the trees. That means the elves had to have had setbacks. There had to have been defeats. No idea about any of that. No idea what specific nature these assaults on Lorien took. We're told two parts of it. That it was due to the valor of the elves defending the land. Well, what was that like? And what part did Galadriel and especially Celeborn have in that? Were they simply directing results, or were they present? And we're also told that against the power of that land, nothing short of Sauron could prevail. That's sorcery. That clearly alludes to Galadriel's ring, or to Galadriel herself. We don't get any of that either. We don't get any details. I want them. I want those details. I'm not going to get them. They don't exist in Tolkien. So, not much. There's a little bit more about a couple of details here and there that exist elsewhere, even further out in the Legendarium. But you know what I want. When I say that I don't have anything here, what I mean is I don't have Tolkien doing a high epic fantasy narrative treatment, which is what I want. That's what I want. And if he's not going to do that, I prefer that he not give me this. This would be fine in a scholarly edition of Lord of the Rings. In one of you mentioned a Norton Critical edition of Lord of the Rings, and I started drooling right there. I don't think we will live long enough to see it, but oh my, that would be nice. Oh my. But I'm talking about something like that. A lovingly, extensively annotated edition of Lord of the Rings that breaks up all of these dumb appendices and puts them in the footnotes where they belong. So you don't keep the appendices in organic shape. You don't do that at all. Instead, when you get to, I don't even know, the lineages of the houses of men, oh goodness. Here, let's get all this out of the way. Are we going to get some Freida Yoga? When you get to some of the Third Age exponents of those houses, you can put the family trees in the footnotes. But you don't put them... What's the matter, baby? Huh? Oh. What's the matter? It's dark and rainy. Ow. All right, I'm going to have to note this. I've gotten really good at oh, stretch those glutes. I've gotten really good at noting when there's Freida Yoga in any video. I don't know why she does that. I've never had a dog that didn't just hop down. But anyway. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. That is the next appendix. We'll move on from here. This serial appendectomy, and sooner or later we'll be done. I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.